There's a question that quietly follows some people for most of their lives. Why was I always the problem? Not because they were violent, not because they were cruel, not because they were difficult, but because somewhere deep inside, they grew up believing that every family conflict somehow led back to them. Maybe you felt that way too. Maybe you were the child who apologized first, even when you weren't wrong. Maybe you became the peacemaker, trying to calm every argument before it got worse. Or maybe you learned that staying silent was safer than telling the truth. If any of this feels familiar, what you're about to hear may completely change the way you see your childhood. Because in many unhealthy family systems, there isn't just conflict. There are roles, invisible roles, roles that no one talks about, but everyone unknowingly follows. One child becomes the responsible one, another becomes the successful one, someone disappears into the background, and sometimes, one child becomes the family's emotional target, the one who gets blamed, criticized, misunderstood, punished more harshly than everyone else. Not because they deserve it, but because the family has unconsciously decided that someone has to carry the emotional weight. Psychologists often refer to this pattern as family scapegoating. And while every family is different, the emotional impact on the child can be remarkably similar. Years later, many of those children become adults who struggle with guilt they can't explain, anxiety that never seems to switch off, or a constant feeling that they have to earn love instead of simply receiving it. The painful part is that most of them don't realize where those feelings began. They simply assume, this is just who I am. But what if it isn't? What if the person you've spent years trying to fix was never actually broken? I'm Dr. Alex, and today we're exploring one of the most misunderstood patterns in family psychology. Not to blame parents, not to label families, but to understand how invisible emotional roles can shape a person's identity, and how recognizing those patterns can be the first step toward healing. Let's begin with a story. Imagine an ordinary family of 5. From the outside, everything looks normal. Family dinners, birthday parties, school events, holiday photos filled with smiles. Nothing seems unusual. But inside the home, something subtle is happening. Whenever the parents argue, one child is blamed for creating stress. If a sibling breaks something, that same child is questioned first. If the atmosphere becomes tense, everyone somehow looks in the same direction. Over time, the child begins to notice a pattern. The rules aren't the same for everyone. When another sibling makes a mistake, it's called an accident. When they make the exact same mistake, it's called a character flaw. When someone else gets angry, they're having a bad day. When they get angry, they're too emotional. The message is never spoken directly, but it's repeated in hundreds of tiny moments. You're the difficult one. Children don't need those words to be said out loud. They learn through experience. And because children naturally trust the adults around them, they rarely question the story they're being given. Instead, they begin to build their identity around it. Maybe I really am the problem. This is what makes family scapegoating so powerful. It doesn't just affect how a child is treated. It slowly changes how they see themselves. Our brains are wired to make sense of the world, especially during childhood. When something painful happens again and again, children search for an explanation. But young children don't usually conclude, my family is under stress, or my parents are struggling with emotions they haven't processed. They reach a much simpler conclusion. There must be something wrong with me. That belief can become the foundation for years of self-doubt. Here's where psychology gives us an important insight. Families function as emotional systems. Each person's behavior influences everyone else. In healthy families, stress is shared, discussed, and gradually resolved. In unhealthy systems, stress is sometimes managed in a very different way. Instead of addressing the real source of the tension, the family unconsciously directs its frustration toward one person. Not because that person caused the problem, but because blaming one individual creates the temporary illusion that the problem has been solved. Think about it for a moment. If every argument can be explained by saying, it's because of Alex, then no one has to ask more difficult questions. Questions like, why are we constantly fighting? Why do we avoid difficult conversations? Why does everyone feel emotionally disconnected? Blaming one child protects the system from confronting uncomfortable truths. Unfortunately, that protection comes at a devastating cost. The child begins carrying emotional burdens that were never theirs to carry. Imagine being handed an invisible backpack, every criticism, every disappointment, every unspoken frustration inside the family. Someone quietly places another stone inside. At first, the backpack feels light, then heavier, then impossible to put down. Years later, the child grows into an adult who still carries it, not because they're weak, but because no one ever told them they were allowed to take it off. One of the biggest misconceptions about scapegoat children is that they're always rebellious or difficult. In reality, many are incredibly thoughtful, empathetic, independent thinkers. They are often the first to notice unfairness, the first to ask uncomfortable questions, the first to recognize that something inside the family doesn't feel right. Ironically, those strengths can make them stand out, and unhealthy systems often resist anyone who, unintentionally, exposes what others are trying not to see. Imagine a 10-year-old asking, "Why does everyone blame me?" No child asks that question unless they've noticed a pattern. The heartbreaking part: many never receive an honest answer. Instead, they're told they're imagining things, too sensitive, too dramatic, or simply difficult. And when the same message is repeated often enough, it begins to sound like the truth. But repetition doesn't create reality, it creates belief. And beliefs, especially the ones formed in childhood, can shape the way we see ourselves for decades. The good news is that beliefs can also change. But before healing can begin, we first have to understand why families fall into these patterns in the first place. Because the answer is far more surprising than most people realize. So why does this happen? Why would a family, often without realizing it, place so much blame on one child? The answer has less to do with the child and far more to do with emotional survival. Every family experiences stress, financial pressure, grief, relationship conflict, unresolved trauma, mental health struggles. None of these challenges automatically create a dysfunctional family. The difference lies in how those challenges are handled. Healthy families ask, "How do we solve this together?" Unhealthy family systems are more likely to ask, "Whose fault is this?" That single difference changes everything. Because once a family begins looking for someone to blame, the search rarely ends with the real cause. Instead, the blame often lands on the person who is least able to defend themselves. A child. Family therapists have long observed that some families unconsciously fall into emotional roles. One child becomes the achiever, another becomes the caretaker, another tries to stay invisible, and one child becomes the emotional lightning rod. Whenever tension builds, the blame strikes the same person, not because they're responsible, but because the family has grown used to seeing them that way. This doesn't mean parents wake up one morning and decide, "Let's make this child the scapegoat." Most of the time, it isn't a conscious decision. It's a pattern that slowly develops over months or years. A misunderstanding becomes a habit becomes a family story. Eventually, the story feels like reality, and that's one of the most dangerous things about emotional patterns. The longer they're repeated, the more normal they begin to feel. Now imagine growing up inside that story. Every time something goes wrong, you brace yourself. Every time someone raises their voice, your heart starts racing. You begin scanning people's faces before they even speak. Not because you're overreacting, but because your nervous system has learned that emotional danger can appear without warning. Psychologists sometimes describe this as hypervigilance. It's a state of heightened awareness that can develop after repeated stress or unpredictable environments. For a child, it can become a survival strategy. You notice every change in tone, every sigh, every slammed door, every uncomfortable silence. As an adult, those same habits may continue. Even in relationships where no one is trying to hurt you. You may assume people are angry when they aren't. You may apologize before anyone accuses you. You may feel responsible for fixing everyone's emotions, not because it's your personality, but because it once helped you feel safe. This is why it's so important to separate who you are from what you had to become in order to survive. Another pattern many former scapegoat children describe is feeling like they never truly belong. Even when they're surrounded by people who care about them, they still expect rejection. They still wait for the moment when someone says, "We've finally figured out who you really are." That's the hidden power of childhood beliefs. They don't simply influence your memories, they influence your expectations. If you expected criticism as a child, you may expect criticism as an adult. If you expected rejection, you may unknowingly prepare for rejection before it even happens. The past quietly teaches the future what to expect. But here's something hopeful. Our expectations are not permanent. The human brain continues to learn throughout life. New experiences, healthy relationships, therapy, self-reflection. All of these can gradually reshape the way we see ourselves and the world around us. Healing doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't mean pretending the past never happened. It means understanding that the strategies which protected you as a child may no longer be necessary today. Maybe staying silent once kept you safe. Today, speaking honestly may help you build healthier relationships. Maybe constantly pleasing others once reduced conflict. Today, setting respectful boundaries may protect your emotional well-being. Growth often feels uncomfortable at first, not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. Many people mistake familiarity for safety. If chaos was familiar, calm may feel strange. If criticism was familiar, kindness may feel suspicious. If love always came with conditions, unconditional support may seem impossible to trust. That's why healing isn't just about changing your behavior. It's also about teaching your mind and body that safety can exist without fear. If you were the scapegoat child, you may spend years trying to prove your worth, trying to become successful enough, helpful enough, perfect enough, to finally deserve acceptance. But here's the truth. Your worth was never supposed to be something you earned. It was always something you had. Long before anyone gave you labels, long before anyone misunderstood you, long before you started carrying burdens that didn't belong to you. Perhaps the most powerful question you can ask yourself today is not, why wasn't I enough? Instead, ask, who taught me that I wasn't enough? That question shifts the focus away from shame and toward understanding. Because shame says, I am the problem. Understanding says, I learned a painful story about myself, and that story can change. And maybe that's the most important message to take away from today's conversation. You are not the role you are assigned. You are not the labels you are given. You are not every criticism you absorbed as a child. You are a human being whose understanding of yourself was shaped by experiences. And experiences can be re-examined, beliefs can be challenged, patterns can be changed. One conversation, one healthy relationship, one act of self-compassion at a time. If today's video helped you see yourself or someone you love in a new light, share it with someone who might need to hear this message. You never know whose life could change simply by realizing that they were never the villain in their own story. I'm Dr. Alex, thank you for watching. Until next time, keep asking difficult questions, keep learning. And remember, understanding your mind is one of the greatest acts of self-respect.